So again, for those who are just joining, I'm Tom Brake, the Director of Unlock Democracy. We campaign on a range of issues: proportional representation, House laws reform, transparency and accountability of government. But in the last couple of months, we've also been focusing as much as we can on the devolution white paper proposals and the way that those could affect England, certain parts of England, with proposals for more mayors, for unitary authorities, for the abolition of district councils. I have just seen that people are introducing themselves in the chat, so please do that. Thank you, Sandy Martin, for kicking off that process. So please do introduce yourselves if you'd like to in the chat. And that's where questions should be put at the point when you feel you've got some burning questions you'd like to address to John. Okay, well, we're 2 minutes in, so I think we will get underway. So it's a real pleasure to introduce John Denham. John Denham, as many of you will know, is a former Member of Parliament and also a former Secretary of State, both for innovation, universities and skills, but also subsequently communities and local government. So very much relevant to our debate tonight. He's now the Director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics at Southampton University, and a very well-known writer on English governance, democracy and national identities, and someone that we very much enjoy working with. So with that short introduction, I'm going to hand over to you, John, to give us 10, 15 minutes on the white paper. I know it may be hard to cram it all in, but as much as you can in that time, and then we'll go into questions from the audience. So thank you for joining us, John.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom. Good evening, everybody, and grateful to Unlock Democracy for enabling me to have this discussion. I'm going to be as fascinated by what the audience has to say about the issue as by my own ideas. I was saying to Tom just before we started, because of the publication date at the time, just before Christmas, pressure for very rapid decisions at local level, there hasn't been as much of a wider public debate or political debate as you might have expected about what are quite some far-reaching proposals. So it's useful for me, certainly in my work at the university, to get a sense of where people are. It's a huge and really quite complex topic. What I hope I will do is emphasize those aspects of this that perhaps are of most interest to the sort of people who I imagine come onto an Unlock Democracy call. That's those that relate to democracy and empowerment. So there's going to be not so much in what I say about what specific powers are going to be devolved to which particular level of local government. That in itself is very important, but that's not where I'm going this evening. Now, just to set the context, England is the most heavily centralised nation in Europe, not just in terms of the very small amount of its money that is spent or raised locally, but also in the fact that we have no legal layer of devolved government with constitutional status. What local government is allowed to do, what powers it's allowed to exercise, are totally at the whim of Whitehall and Westminster. And even back in the 1980s, when the Conservative government was, for example, taking things like bus services out of local control, the debate in Westminster was much more about whether this was a good policy than whether this was an offence against what local people should have a right to decide to themselves. And that's a real problem, the lack of a constitutional layer of local government. And the history over the last 40 years, just briefly, is of successive governments reducing the resources available to local government, reducing their fiscal autonomy in how much they can raise, reducing the powers and functions and moving things out either to privatisation, quangos, or taking them to the centre. We've seen the number of councils and councillors reduced, and for many councillors have a much smaller part to play in the governance of their local authority under the cabinet system than it is under the old committee system, and you have an even tighter grip on outcomes at the centre. That's been a 40-year process, and we need to say that because there have been steps towards devolution over the past 10 years. they have to be seen against that 40-year process of centralisation. And also, of course, the austerity of the last 14 years has left many local councils themselves in a really parlous financial state. So I could get to this stage and say, actually, what everybody should be talking about is, what do we actually want a local democratic state to do? What are the things that we think should be in the hands of local people and the people they elect to decide? That is not the debate that this white paper is kicking off. It is not as profound as that. What it is doing is giving us an incremental development of the devolution process of the past 10 years. So I suspect most people know most of what I'm about to say, but just briefly. The model for the last 10 years has been the establishment of combined authorities. That's where local authorities legally pool their powers with a directly elected mayor. And where mayoral combined authorities have been established, they receive a limited amount of additional funding, plus the devolution of some specific pools of government money, typically, for example, around adult skills, the ability to have more consultation with government agencies over, for example, transport and highways, and the powers that are available to those mayoral combined authorities have been set out in a series of devolution deals with central government. Up until now, each deal has been different, though sometimes by a lot, sometimes by not very much. It's been a very slow and incremental process. So 10 years after the first devolution deal with Greater Manchester, the total amount of resources that have been devolved to combined mayoral local authorities is less than £3 billion a year, compared with the amount of local public service spending in total, which is at least £250 billion a year. So what's really been devolved is quite a small part of public spending. In its simplest form, the white paper and the promised English devolution bill set out to do a number of things. Firstly, to avoid confusion, it renames combined authorities as strategic authorities. And there are going to be 3 levels of strategic authorities, and each level will have a defined set of powers. So the government is moving away from a fairly arbitrary set of deals in which there are no clearly published ground rules into a legal framework of the powers that are going to be available. Those 3 levels, briefly, are established strategic authorities, essentially the big city regions, originally Manchester, West Midlands, now joined by South Yorkshire and others, that have been going for some time, have had mayors in place for some time, have built up some sort of structure for delivery. The next layer, the middle layer, are the not called established mayoral authorities, but mayoral strategic authorities. These are the newer ones that have come into existence recently and ones that will be formed over the next couple of years. And finally, there's something called a foundation strategic authority, which are the ones that choose at this stage not to have a mayor. And as you might imagine, those 3 levels attract different levels of power. So the established strategic authorities will get the biggest powers. They will get a single or integrated budget, bringing together a number of currently central government resource streams around primarily economic development issues like housing, transport, infrastructure, skills, and so on. By comparison, mayoral strategic authorities will get some additional funding, but fewer additional powers. Foundation strategic authorities will actually gain relatively little in terms of real devolution. All of these authorities will benefit from the consolidation of lots of different pots of money, which local councillors on the call will know can cost a fortune to bid for, and most of the time you don't get it. That should come as a simplified pot of money. Ultimately, the government's pretty clear that it wants all of the areas to accept a directly elected mayor in the not too distant future. One thing that will be of interest is that the government does want to move quickly to get strategic planning in place right across England irrespective of whether people have got strategic authorities in place, that's clearly essential for its growth and housing strategy. So, in simplest form, there's a statutory legal framework will replace the arbitrary deals of the current system. There'll be clarity on which powers are available to each level and clarity on how an area can move from one level to the next. The government has very importantly said about the statutory framework that it will be possible to add additional devolved powers to the statutory framework, but not to take them away. So effectively creating a ratchet that should always move in the direction of more devolution. The language of the white paper talks about devolution by default. Having said that, it has to be said that there's a lot in the white paper which is really about enhanced consultation powers for strategic authorities rather than devolution. I mean, I did a word count on the number of times the white paper said that strategic authorities will work with government agencies or have a role in an area of policy. Those phrases turn up no less than 100 times, I think 110 times in the white paper. So this is not areas where strategic authorities will take over control of what happens. They'll have greater consultative powers, and a lot will depend really in the long run on how that develops, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So that, if you like, what I've described is the core offer. But there's an additional factor which no one was expecting even at the end of September. The government not only wants to extend the coverage of strategic authorities to the whole of England, but in basically around half of England outside of London, which currently has a mixture of all-purpose unitary councils or two-tier areas of county and district councils, there the government wants to push two different processes at the same time. On the one hand, it wants to encourage the current county and unitary councils to work together to propose new strategic authorities. But at the same time, it's proposing a reorganisation of all the two-tier areas. So there will no longer be areas that have a county council and a district council. They will be expected to reorganise themselves into unitary councils, which will be large. The white paper talks about a minimum size of 500,000 people. Now, typical metropolitan borough, for example, is about 200,000 people. Lots of unitary councils at the moment are 150,000 people. Lots of district councils are even smaller. So these are large unitary authorities. Now, the word is that ministers are saying privately, well, they may not be quite as big as 500,000. We may accept some smaller than that, but it's still a very big change. And this came out of the blue. It was first mentioned not in anything from the department, but came out in the budget. And it's seen by pretty much everyone as a Treasury imposition that has a lot more to do with alleged budget savings than devolution itself. It's based on a PwC report that suggested that something like £2 to £3 billion could be saved over 5 years. That's there's lots of skeptics about that in local government because reorganisation brings heavy costs, even if it brings long-term savings. But that's brought an additional element into play in many areas of the country outside the big metropolitan city regions. There are two things that I think are missing from the white paper that are very important. One is it's not actually clear what the future role of local authorities will be. Nowhere in the white paper does it set out those functions that will always be the responsibility of local councils rather than the new strategic authorities. And that makes the future really quite uncertain. There have been various suggestions that maybe social care should be taken away from local authorities or other functions changed, or the mayors should assume various responsibilities. So we're looking at quite an uncertain future for local democracy. What will the people you elect as councillors and councillor leaders be responsible for? That's not necessarily going to be addressed, I think, in the immediate future. The second issue, which is missing, is what some people call hyperlocalism, other people call community empowerment. In other words, how is power going to be exercised at community level? And this obviously becomes an even more pressing point if you're abolishing smaller district councils, small unitaries, and creating much bigger unitary authorities. Now, here the government's promised a communities white paper, hopefully to come out before the English devolution bill. Minister Alex Norris is allegedly working or leading on that piece of work. But until that comes out, there's a big gap. And this is important because often there's a loose rhetoric about enabling the council to deal with empty shops in the high street or stop a pub closing, but it's much more profound than that. It's at local level that, for example, most health prevention work needs to operate if you're actually going to build a healthier society. It's at a hyper local level, at a community level, where usually you have to have the networks that act in the interests of children operating effectively. So we need to know more about that. So I hope I'm not going on too long, Tom, but just to take a few more minutes. That's a rather simplistic overview of a long white paper, but let me just draw out some of the democratic issues that it throws up. So the first is, how much is this actually a fundamental shift of power from the centre to the local? And I think you have to say only to a certain extent. It's undoubtedly an extension on what we have at the moment. But as a real shift in power, it's limited in a number of ways. Firstly, by the scale of resources that are likely to be devolved, and accompanying that, the limited range of devolved power. There's no radical change in the funding formula for local government or in fiscal devolution, enabling local government to raise more of its own funds. So it's only a limited extension of devolution as we have it at the moment. Secondly, although there'll be a statutory framework for devolution, the whip hand still lies with central government. There will be consultation with mayors and with local government leaders, but ultimately it's the government that gets to decide what goes into that devolution framework. And as far as anyone can see, funding and fiscal devolution doesn't even get discussed there, but stays with the Treasury. The second area of concern about devolution is accountability. Although the government is trying to simplify the system of accountability, the underlying assumption is that local authorities and strategic authorities have to account for themselves to central government. That it is central government that is going to largely shape what they're expected to achieve with the additional funds that they get. There's not here a move towards more effective local systems of accountability that break the dependence on being answerable to Whitehall. A fourth area that's important is the relationship between local authorities and mayors. The history of this is that combined local authorities were originally a local government solution to a local government problem, which was that local governments wanted a legal vehicle to share some of their powers to work together effectively. Mayors were always a Whitehall answer to a Whitehall problem, which is that people in Whitehall didn't want to have to deal with all these local authorities, and they wanted to have one person in a local sub-region that they could deal with and effectively control through their grip over resources. In practice, both local authorities and central government have got something what they want out of the system. Local authorities have found that mayors have enabled them to have more clout, more say, bring in some more resources. Central government has had prominent people they can deal with. So maybe it's worked out reasonably. People will have different views on that. What's clear about the white paper is that it subtly shifts power from local councils to mayors. So mayors will no longer have to get the agreement of all the local authorities in their strategic authority area for major decisions that they want to take. And there is a worry in some local authorities that at the end of the day, this whole process will lead to mayors trying to take over more of the things that local councils do, as much as mayors will be operating more powers that have been devolved from Whitehall. So mayors and local authorities is an important area to think about. On local government reorganisation, I won't go that in detail. All I would say is there's very little time to get it right. The last big local government reorganization lasted for 50 years. Let's assume this one will. Does it make sense to be approaching it with quite the urgency that the government is, and where frankly the ground rules about how much you can change your local arrangements are not clear at all? But as important as that is how are voters expected to relate to much bigger authorities than they're used to at the moment, and ones which inevitably won't have the same sense of local identity that they have at the moment. I'm not saying it's a change that shouldn't happen. It's going to be extremely challenging to get it right on the timetables we've got. And then we have the area I've already mentioned about community empowerment below the local authority. And we need to get that out effectively. Finally, as you expect me to say on this call, electoral democracy. When mayors were first introduced, the system of elections was an alternative vote system, or I always get confused by my electoral systems, and there's lots of experts on this, as I think it was a single transferable vote. Anyway, it enabled people to have preferences in the voting. The government then changed that in favour of first past the post. There has as yet been no announcement by Labour to go back to the preferential treatment, which, given the current polls, would make the outcome of many mayoral elections really quite random and possibly down to a few percentages of votes on first past the post, with everybody getting the less than 30% of the first preferences. The new authorities will also be first past the post, but it does feel like a missed opportunity to move towards a more proportional system and a more pluralistic approach. So what might we do over the weeks ahead to try to strengthen the approach? I think we could give local government more of a voice in the devolution framework by making the consultation with mayors and local governments a statutory process. I think we should argue that the devolution framework should set out what responsibilities local authorities can have, as well as those that go to strategic authorities. I think we could change the system of accountability so that responsibility for local strategies and local outcomes lie with local institutions, not by accountability to central government. I think we could argue for more flexibility in local government reorganisation. I think we could require mayors, strategic authorities and local authorities to produce a statutory community empowerment plan, setting out how they would ensure that their responsibilities are exercised at a more local level. And finally, we could bring back the preferential voting system for mayors and introduce proportional voting for local authorities. Now, thanks for your patience. You've stuck with me rather longer than I intended to be, but I tried to end up with an agenda around democratic reform, but I felt I needed to set out some of the parameters of the white paper, at least for some people on the call in the first place. So back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, John. A tour de force trying to cram in the 150 page, I think it is, devolution white paper into 15 minutes or so. So thank you for doing that. I've got a couple of questions that I will pose, but then there are also lots of questions coming in the Q&A. And sorry, I said put them in the chat. I didn't mean that. I meant put them in the Q&A, and people are now doing that. So thank you. So I think the devolution white paper is called a devolution white paper. A number of people have questioned in the chat and the Q&A whether in fact it is legitimate to call it a devolution white paper. You said in your introductory remarks that England is the most heavily centralized part of Europe. And would I be right in thinking that your assessment is that after these proposals are implemented, England risks being even more heavily centralized than it was before the devolution white paper was enacted?
Not quite. No, I think it will be less centralized than the current system, because there will be more certainty about what gets devolved and more things will be devolved. but we will not be moving towards a European style system where you have a constitutionally entrenched system of local government where certain responsibilities belong to the devolved layer and they are not for the centre to take away. So we're moving in the right direction, but it won't be worse. However, one caveat. What we could see is a consolidation of power at the strategic authority level, which is a mix of things that have come down from Whitehall, but if we're not careful, also things that have been moved up from local councils. So, now that would not be out of step within a lot of Europe. In a lot of Europe, that sort of sub-regional area is the most powerful unit of local governance, but I'm not sure that would be a good direction. Those of us who would like to see subsidiarity run through the system won't like that second part if it moves powers upwards.
Okay, one further question from me, and then I'll throw it open to the Q&A. When the government published the white paper, Unlock Democracy with the Electoral Reform Society involved, Citizen Network and a number of other groups issued a statement saying that devolution shouldn't just be about economic growth, but it should also be about greater community involvement in decision making, which you referred to. Are we supposed to hang all our hopes on the communities? I'm not sure if that's a white paper or a bill that's going to follow. So where can we put our energies into trying to ensure that, given that it's absent from the devolution white paper, that there is community involvement that goes beyond allowing a local community to buy a pub?
Yeah, well, the focus I think needs to be on that in a couple of ways. The, whether it's a white paper or not, I don't know. It's always described by ministers, this new paper, as part of the same process. I've heard Jim McMahon say originally it was going to be one big white paper, then it was going to be too big. So that will be part of the debate here, and hopefully in time for the English devolution bill. But I think this community and many others need to be thinking about how would we like to see that operate, given that there's different ways of empowering local communities. So there are some places with parish councils and town councils. Many of the unitary cities, for example, don't have any level of governance below that level, but do a lot of community empowerment. So I think this is the time for people to be saying, well, actually, if we were writing that white paper, what would we put in it? And actually measure what we get, maybe in just a few weeks' time, against those aspirations.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to move into the questions. I'm not necessarily going to be able to do them in a entirely sensible order, as I'm going to work my way through them. But the first question from Kathy Grant is, why is central government so keen on mayors, and is there an issue in terms of accountability? I remember asking a mayor, I'm not going to name them, what role, for instance, they thought local councillors had in holding them to account. And the answer, frankly, was none at all. So why is the government so keen on mayors, and how do you ensure that there is appropriate accountability?
Okay. One, central government likes mayors because it means they don't have to deal with councils. I mean, bluntly, that is why Whitehall likes mayors, because it gives you far fewer people to have to deal with. The argument in favour of mayors from people who support them is it gives you a clear, identifiable voice for an area. And I think there's no doubt that some people like Andy Burnham in Manchester or Andy Street, who was the mayor in the West Midlands, used, if you like, the public platform, the convening power, very, very effectively. So they do have some roles. On the other hand, the accountability issue is a real problem. Westminster politicians tend to say, well, you've got one person, they're accountable to the public. But actually, if they're just a leader of the strategic authority, it's very difficult to tell what it was the mayor did and what it was the local councils did. And I don't suppose most people are clearer what they're voting for when they vote for a mayor than when they vote for a council. The real weakness is that we lack proper, robust institutions at local level to hold mayors accountable. The scrutiny committees of local councils don't do that effectively. The leaders on combined authorities don't do it effectively. And rather than trying to make these mayors more accountable to Whitehall, which is what the government wants to do, I think we should be debating how you have greatly improved and more independent scrutiny at local level.
Okay, thank you. A question from Jennifer Budden. How will it work when the mayor and unitary councils are of different parties?
Well, the answer is it can work if you have a collaborative leadership style. So, for example, Andy Burnham works in Greater Manchester, where there are a number of Conservative authorities. It is more difficult, though, if the strategic authority as a whole has a different politics to the mayor. Now, we've seen that. We've seen that in the West of England Combined Authority. We've seen that in Cambridge and Peterborough, and it is much harder to make it work effectively where you don't have that same the general tendency to all have the same politics, and the West Midlands has been more difficult than other regions. One of the arguments, I would say, for having a more proportional system of election for local authorities is that actually that would generate a more pluralist culture in local government that would make the tensions between a mayor and local authorities less marked.
I mean, on that point, what do you think is, given your experience as a Secretary of State in two different departments in a Labour government, what would be your advice about how to argue with the government that they should be considering proportional representation for the elections to these new unitary authorities?
If I was being honest about this, I would be I'd argue in quite a political way, which is not perhaps the principled answer you're asking me to make, Tom. But the political argument would be this, that we are going to see an enormous number of elections over the next 2 or 3 years for mayors and for new local authorities in areas which are not in Labour's traditional local government base, but where you now have a large number of Labour MPs with very small majorities. But these elections are likely to produce uniformly, depending on where you are, Conservative, Lib Dem or Reform-led mayors and local authorities. And that's going to be a very difficult situation for a government that has a large majority but very fragile majority as they approach the next election. So I would be tending to say it might well actually be in the Labour Party's interests to have a more pluralistic system of election for all these council elections, because you're likely to have less of an opportunity for stark rejection of Labour politics and the rising up of people who are going to be Labour critics. Now, I apologise to everybody on the call who's got no interest in the future of the Labour Party, but if you're asking me about how I would make the argument, Tom, that is one of the arguments we should make. And we all know the principles. You know, I guess we're all on this call because we know the principled arguments for a different way of doing things. I think the argument I made earlier, that pluralist democracy and strategic authorities is more likely to produce inclusive and functioning mayoral systems, is another one that we should make. And I think we just need to get those arguments out there. This is an opportunity. You know, the government says its democracy agenda is not over. I heard in the last 48 hours they're still saying they plan to lower the voting age in time for the next general election. We should try and stiffen the resolve to say, let's do this. It's worth a try.
Thank you. A question now from Ian Driver, who's a council member of Unlock Democracy and indeed suggested that we organise this session. His question is about the proposed unitary authorities are going to lead to a loss of several thousand councillors. And I think he's right in saying that this is likely to make it much harder for people, women, members of ethnic minorities, LGBTQ plus communities actually to get elected, because these unitary authorities are going to be much larger and I think probably more prone to elect candidates from the major parties. So what's your view in terms of how this will affect representation?
I think the the worst argument in the white paper is that it says, oh, well, people will be very pleased because there'll be fewer politicians. And I think it's not good when a Westminster government actually suggests that electing people locally is a bad idea. And nothing actually in the survey results you see about people's confidence in local authorities and councillors suggests that they are less popular than MPs. And generally speaking, I'm not saying they're wildly popular, but generally speaking, there's far more confidence in locally elected people. And I do think that if you reduce the number of councillors, there is a danger of it reducing diversity. Secondly, if you adopt, as most places will do, the cabinet model, even the backbench councillors on most of those local authorities will have really little strategic influence over the direction. So you are creating a real danger both of losing diversity and also diluting the value of individual votes within an area. Now, given where we are, that's why I think the proposals I put forward earlier for a statutory framework for devolution of powers within local authorities, it will vary from area to area, is one way that we need to build community empowerment into the new structures.
Okay, thank you. There have been a number of questions about how was this sort of estimate of 500,000 people arrived at. I mean, slightly caveated, as you said, by government ministers saying, well, actually, it might not need to be 500,000. Do you know what the logic for settling on that was?
Yeah, I think it comes directly or fairly directly from a PwC report that was commissioned by the County Council's network. I mean, some people might suggest the County Council's network had an interest in a system that gets rid of district councils. But anyway, they commissioned the report. And I think the argument was that, you reduce the number of chief executives, the number of town halls, the number of operating systems, the number of councillors, and have all sorts of other efficiency savings that produce this saving over a 5-year period of time. And one of the things they said in that report was, there's no point in getting rid of district councils, but having a whole load of councils that are only a bit bigger. So the sizes in the white paper came from that analysis. Now, as I said, quite a lot of people are a bit skeptical about whether all of those savings will ever emerge, but that's where it came from. The practical reality of it, though, is that the ministers, by putting it in the white paper, have created a problem for themselves, because on the one hand, they've been saying to councils like Exeter, well, this is your chance to become a unitary council, or Exeter's going to go, what, 130, 140,000 people. By the time you've added in the other 350,000 people, it's not going to look much like Exeter. And I think that ministers are probably trying to get themselves a bit of wriggle room. Having said that, I would be quite surprised if anywhere is allowed to have a unitary much less than 350,000, unless they're somewhere geographically unique, like the Isle of Wight or something of that sort.
A question from Cliff around sort of going down to the really local level, that he doesn't think, and I think he's right, I think I looked as well, that there's no reference to parish councils in here. Now, clearly, I think whilst the government talk about unitary authorities, at the same time, I think they are suggesting that parish councils can continue, and also town councils, I think I'm right in saying. So is that something that might get picked up in the community's white paper?
Well, I'm hoping that the community's white paper will pick up all of that. I should declare an interest as the entirely honorary president of the Hampshire Association of Local Councils, which is town and parish councils here in Hampshire, where I am. And there's clearly a potential role to play. I think the difficulty is for me, and is finding a consistent approach everywhere. If I looked at our members in Hampshire, they vary between groups that councils that struggle to have enough co-options to keep going, to ones that really are multi-million pound organisations running a wide range of very important functions at local level. And I think the question is going to be, are we going to try and have a single model of local governance, Or are we going to have a more flexible approach that enable areas that can create the institutional capacity to take on far more power than they have at the moment, and have other areas where the approach is different? And that brings you into the area between the more rural and suburban areas and the town areas and some of the unitary cities that by and large aren't parished at all at the moment.
Okay, now I'm afraid, because I've been trying to do this in a structured way, it's probably going to go a bit random in terms of the questions that I'm going to ask you. There was a question, just a point of clarification. We've been using acronyms, so FTP, so first past, FPTP, first past the post, so first past the post electoral system. So we'll try to avoid using those. A question here about the paper doesn't propose anything, as far as I understand it, in relation to London, although, of course, the London boroughs are not at 500,000 people. So maybe in the future there might be. But a question from John Morland: is there any scope in the white paper for the mayors, existing or new, to have an assembly like the London Assembly, to try to ensure that there is a greater degree perhaps of scrutiny?
No, there isn't. London is mentioned in the white paper, but not with any specific changes to London being proposed. People have different views. My own view is that, in principle, the strategic authority or combined authority approach is a better structure than the structure in London. I'm not convinced that the GLA is particularly effective in scrutiny of the mayor, and the London structure has a much weaker relationship between London boroughs and the Mayor of London than, for example, the local authorities in Greater Manchester and the Mayor of Manchester. So if there were going to be an alignment, I suspect it would, and this may never happen, but it would be more London moving towards the strategic authority model in the rest of England rather than the other way around. The point about boroughs in London, of course, the same is true in the Met. So most metropolitan boroughs are much smaller than the 500,000 that's being talked about in the more rural parts of England. And it's quite interesting. There weren't any proposals in the white paper for rationalising boroughs by forcing them to merge, even though that would presumably produce the same sort of cost savings. Now, that may be more to do with the fact that some ministers are more familiar with boroughs and how they operate than they are two-tier areas, and think the job is easier in those more rural areas. But there is certainly an inconsistency of approach.
I should have said that question came from iPhone Bill, so Bill on his iPhone. A question from Peter Hurst. What is the mechanism for including small areas that cannot easily fit into these mayoral authorities? As I understand it, it's an instruction from government that you're going to do what we say, or we're going to require you to do something if you haven't decided to do it.
Yeah, and that is what governments said it will do, and will take powers in the bill apparently to require people to do this if necessary. And it is leading us to some quite difficult decisions. There was a vote last week, perhaps, or the week before, by BCP Council. People who are not familiar with it, that's Bournemouth, Christchurch, and Poole, as was. And they were basically forced into a very hurried decision about whether they wanted to join with a strategic authority that will cover Hampshire and Solent, or look to the west into a strategic authority that involves Dorset, Wiltshire, and large parts of Somerset. And it was a very narrow vote, and it was also a vote taken without any serious economic analysis of the pros and cons of moving in one direction or another, and how they might actually operate. But that would have been a classic, there was, I think there was quite a small margin between the two choices. Some councillors rejected the idea of joining either strategic authority. Had the majority of BCP councillors refused to join either, government would come along and have forced them to join one or the other. And I'm not saying which is the right decision or not, but I am quite worried that we've had people being forced to take quite hurried decisions on relatively little evidence. And if you go around the country, I'm not by any means an expert, but I hear that Swindon has a difficulty. Does it go back in with Wiltshire that it only recently left, or should it align with the Thames Valley, or is it orientated towards Gloucestershire? So there are lots of places around the country where it's not obvious to people where they should fit.
Just on that question of the accelerated time frame, would I be right in thinking that probably not a single local authority has been able to consult its community about proposals that had to go in by the 10th of January?
I think it would have been quite impossible. I also know that in some areas that I've been in touch with people, there's been no consultation, even with organized groups like businesses. And in some areas, there was barely any time for discussion within political groups on local authorities. And in many areas, even if you didn't talk to the public, there was not time to have a political discussion between councillors and party members. So there's an awful lot of people, and I'm not casting aspersions on people's motives. There are going to be an awful lot of people out there who will feel a decision has been taken over which they had no say. And it's not obvious to me that that was necessary.
Indeed.
It's largely pushed by the reorganization thing. And an alternative approach, and one that, for what it's worth, I would have advocated, would have actually been to concentrate on getting the strategic authorities and devolution in place, and then be very clear that in 5 years' time there would be a round of local government reorganisation. If you wanted to end up in the same place. At the moment, you're asking hard-pressed council officers, and there are far fewer of them than there were 14 years ago, not only to form strategic authorities and think about exercising devolved powers, but also to handle local government reorganisation with all of the difficulties and sensitivities that involves.
Mm. We conducted a survey of councillors, all councillors in England, got just over 830 responses. And contrary to what Jim McMahon has said, which is that there has been no opposition to these proposals, we did detect quite a significant level of opposition to these proposals. And in the comments that were made, it was very clear that people are very worried about the ability that councils have to do this work alongside trying to tackle fundamental problems like social care. I mean, what is it possible for councils to do this?
I think it's going to be extremely difficult to do it well. That's the problem. People will do it, but whether they will do it well, I mean, just one of the things you've talked about is social care. Lots of local authorities are in serious financial difficulties because of social care. So if I think about where I live in Hampshire, I think it's something like 83% of Hampshire's budget is spent on social care. Just down the road, Southampton has had to have a capitalisation agreement with central government to avoid going down the Section 114, so close to bankruptcy approach. That's largely because of social care costs. You then got to create unitary authorities in Hampshire, which probably mean a larger Southampton and the breaking up of Hampshire, and then you had to allocate those costs fairly across the different organizations. You had to reorganize the delivery of your social care teams and leadership at a time when there's very little extra money, and you've got to get that right at the same time as you're potentially talking about redrawing the boundaries of Southampton and redrawing boundaries within Hampshire. That is an enormously complex delivery task. And whilst I have the highest admiration for the quality of people working in local government, the chances of somebody getting it wrong is quite high. You then got issues just over the border in Surrey, where, for example, Woking Council, a small district council, ran up a massive amount of public borrowing in a regeneration project. Does Surrey or the new Surrey unitaries and their taxpayers have to take responsibility for the money that was run up by Woking Council? Now, everyone agrees it's a problem. I've not heard yet that anybody's come up with the answer. Is the Treasury likely to say, well, we'll just write that off, guys? I don't think so, listening to the mood music coming out of the Treasury at the moment. So we're making it an incredibly difficult thing to do. One of the reasons I think, Tom, that government says there hasn't been much opposition is that there is a certain air of political reality out here. People are saying government's got a huge majority, all right, even if it's unpopular, it's going to be around for another 4 years. This is going to happen. This is not something that we can stop by delaying it for a year or two, get on with it. And the prevailing mood, I think, amongst local government leaders has been one of saying, okay, we've just got to try and make the best we can out of that. That hasn't created the space for the worries, the concerns, the potential dissents to come out, which are probably there somewhere in the system. And it's interesting to hear about your survey.
Well, I will share that with you, and I will be sharing it with Jim McMahon as well, because the comments are worth reading. A question about the mayor's democratic legitimacy. Do they have legitimacy when they are elected on 30% of the vote or thereabouts?
Well, the trouble with that is you can apply that to quite a lot of councillors as well. Yes, they do have a legitimacy. The question really is, does their direct election give them a legitimacy that is greater than the legitimacy of the local authorities? And I would say no. Okay, it's equivalent to perhaps, but it's not greater than. Central government tends to regard local mayors as being more legitimate than local councils, which they somehow think that because their leaders aren't directly elected, don't count in the same way. I'd say, in fairness to the current government, I think that's much more an attitude of Whitehall officials than current ministers. I think local Jim McMahon, those who know him, was rooted in local government, was a very, very effective leader of Oldham Council, leader of the Labour group on the LGA. So I don't think I wouldn't put Jim in that category. I think he is genuinely concerned about the future of local government. But as far as the Treasury or Whitehall are concerned, they would really, I think, rather not have to deal with local authorities at all. I'm
Okay.
overstating that, but you take the point that I'm making.
Indeed. A question from David Murray about obviously there was an attempt some years ago for regional government in the northeast, which was defeated in a referendum. Is there any way in which setting up strategic authorities in England that cover all of the country might be a path into something that looks like elected regional government?
Not on the current trajectory, but what I think there will be, although government's quite vague about it at the moment, is a growth of regional structures. So, for example, strategic authorities coming together on issues that they can't tackle even at a city region level. So, most obviously, that's likely to be strategic transport issues, rail issues, future planning of road networks. It's likely to be decentralized energy networks, a whole series of things that take a regional approach. But I think it's more likely that that will be a coming together of strategic authorities at a leadership level, perhaps bringing the mayors together rather than a directly elected assembly. Because I think the difficulty of the directly elected assembly is very much what it was back at the time the Labour government that I was part of lost the North East Assembly. It looks like you're imposing another layer on top of people. I think we can get a regional outcome out of this by collaboration between strategic authorities. That's certainly the direction the government's setting, and I think is probably where most of us should put our, who knows what might happen in 10 years' time. But for the next 5 or 10 years, I think it's building regional collaboration is going to be the name of the game.
Okay, thank you. I think we're probably very nearly at the end. I just wanted to ask you one final question, which is this question of elections. Now, when this has happened in the past, as I understand it, it has taken between 2 and 3 years to make the change, which could mean potentially that some parts of England will not have elections for a 6 or 7 year period. Am I right? And would that be democratically acceptable, given that what this will mean is that the people who will be negotiating over these changes to unitaries may well not be the people who would have been negotiating it had there been elections taking place.
Yeah, I think there's a real problem. I can understand, given what the government's set out to do, its desire not, if you like, to have elections that disrupt a process of negotiation. But I think if there's a long drawn out process before the new unitaries get into place, there is a real democratic deficit if you are, as you say, possibly 7 years from the election first taking place. So I do understand why the government has said, and no doubt the county councils have probably said, if we have elections, they might all be fought on the issue of whether people want local government reorganisation or not. Unlikely, in my view, much as we find it fascinating on this call. That isn't usually what elections are fought over, but there could be a long period of time, as you say, before the new arrangements come into place. From a personal point of view, if the timetable is stuck to and you get mayoral elections next May in these areas and the new unitaries the year after, I think that's livable with. If it drags on before that, then I think it becomes unacceptable. But I could quite understand the arguments of people who are sort of saying it's just in principle wrong to get rid of elections that would have been held this year. And if I was a party that was hoping I might have made gains in this May, I can quite understand why people feel cheated just at the time that they might have had a stronger local voice.
Thank you, John. We'll draw this to a close. Are there any sort of concluding remarks? Any significant points you'd like to make?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to recognise is that there is going to be an actual piece of legislation. It's worth noting that most of the devolution that took place over the last 10 years, although there was a levelling up bill a year ago, most of it took place outside any sort of legislative structure. So there will be legislation, there will be debates in Parliament, there will be the opportunities, hopefully, to find sympathetic MPs to promote amendments for people to lobby their own local MPs about whether this works for their area. So I think in this area, sometimes we push our desire for change, but it's very hard to focus our attention on something that's actually going through Parliament. I think the potential we've got now in the next 6 to 9 months is to actually have a real campaign and find ways. If we think the electoral system should change, if the mayors should be done differently, if there should be more of a statutory voice for local government, aim at least to get those things aired in Parliament, properly discussed, create a situation where MPs have to vote on them, put their cards on the table, make a stance, justify their decision. That's why I think I was so keen to do this call, because this isn't a sort of broad policy debate. This is going to make a legal change to how local government operates, and we all ought to be engaged in that debate, whatever side we take on any of the particular things we've talked about this evening.
Well, thank you, John. The comments in the chat are very positive about your contribution tonight, so that's very welcome. And we, as an organisation, Unlock Democracy, we certainly will be taking up some of these issues when a bill, perhaps hopefully a draft bill, emerges. And we'd certainly like to work with you on some of them, particularly around, for instance, making sure that there's a fair voting system used for unitaries. So thank you, everyone. This has been recorded, as I think was announced at the beginning. So if you do want to watch it again or want to share the link, it will be up hopefully within the next couple of days on our YouTube site. And we will, of course, be organising other events of a similar nature in the months to come. So thank you very much, John, again. And thank you, everyone, for attending, and Grace for organising the tech side of the evening. So see you all again soon, I hope. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Thank you.